Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another episode of How to Speak Victorian. Now, if you have been here rather quite a while, you may remember that quite a while ago I had a series going on this channel called How to Speak Victorian, in which I spoke about Victorian literature and Victorian history, the way they intertwined, and about why I love the Victorian period in literature so much. Now, I haven't made a video in this series for ages and ages. I have never made an episode of How to Speak Victorian in this flat before, which means I haven't made an episode of How to Speak Victorian for probably about 6 months. So, previous to this video here, I had made a kind of introductory video about why I love the Victorians, which was probably over a year ago now. I then made a video about the literary history of the Victorian period, one about the general historical context of the Victorian period, and then I did a few videos about the important novelists of the Victorian period and the important poets of the Victorian period. And then my life became very, very busy and I ran out of time to do the research and the filming, and I just haven't made one of these for ages. But here we are today to talk about drama and the theatre within the Victorian period. I thought I would carry on my series at long last and finally get back into How to Speak Victorian. So today we're going to be talking about drama and the theatre in the Victorian period. So today we are finally continuing with the series How to Speak Victorian. I will link all the previous videos in the series down below. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the important dramatists from the Victorian period, as well as about the wider social and cultural connotations and impacts of the theatre during the Victorian period. Just as a quick reminder before I continue, the Victorian period refers to the time period in Britain and Ireland between 1837 and 1901, when Queen Victoria was the Queen. So in my previous videos from a long time ago about Victorian novelists and poets, I had a lot of names to go through and a lot of very important, very significant, very, very well-known books and poems to speak about. When we think about like the greatest British novels ever written, or even the greatest novels of all time throughout the world, like a lot of Victorian ones come up. If you read like those long lists of 100 books to read before you die, a lot of them will be Victorian. So many Victorian novelists are incredibly famous. The Victorian poets are slightly less famous, but at the same time there are a lot of very, very well-known Victorian poets, a lot of poems that we still know very well today. Drama, a bit less so. If you think of Victorian literature, normally you don't think of many plays. If you look at Victorian literature courses at university, very few of them include many plays. Occasionally there'll be an Oscar Wilde or a George Bernard Shaw play, but in general, there just isn't that much drama. We don't really talk about Victorian drama. And the reason for this is not that there weren't plays being performed, but that for the most part, either they were performing old plays from before the Victorian period, they performed a lot of Shakespeare, or they were performing plays which we don't remember and we like to forget because they in general were not considered very good. Even the two playwrights from the Victorian period that are remembered and whose plays are still performed and read, George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde, we tend to remember Oscar Wilde much more for The Picture of Dorian Gray than for his plays, even though his plays are absolutely brilliant. And George Bernard Shaw, oh, I can never say his name, George Bernard Shaw, we always tend to think about as Edwardian. Admittedly, the bulk of his plays were written after the Victorian period, but actually quite a few of his most famous plays were written in the 1890s in the Victorian period, but we don't really associate him with the Victorian period and with Victorian drama because Victorian drama does not have very many associations at all, and if it does, they're kind of negative. There was a lot of melodrama, there were a lot of sentimental romance, adventure things. Throughout the 19th century, a lot of people went to the theatre, a lot of theatres were built, a lot of people were going to the theatre all the time, but in general, people who wanted a highbrow theatre experience went to see Shakespeare or they went to the opera, and people who did not went to see melodramas or pantomimes. The Victorian period was when pantomimes were really born. Or they went to see sentimental adventure stories, they went to see historical romances, lots and lots of plays that have just completely gone out of print and been forgotten today. Like when you read non-fiction written about the theatre in the Victorian period, you just don't know any of the names of the plays they're talking about except the Shakespeare ones, because we've just forgotten nearly all of them, because in general Victorian drama was not really considered that good. Obviously I don't know whether it was bad because I cannot go back and see them, and a lot of the plays that were commonly performed and were loved are out of print, but in general it is kind of considered that Victorian theatre might not have been that good, and a lot of people throughout the Victorian period were bemoaning the loss of great British dramatic traditions and were saying, you know, that Shakespeare was brilliant and no plays today were very, very good. So George Bernard Shaw in the 1890s was complaining a lot about the fact that there were so few new plays being performed, that the only new plays that were performed were melodramas, and that there was no really like good good, actual, like, high-class, proper, good drama. And even Dickens, in some of his writing on the theatre, says the same kind of thing. And Dickens loved the theatre. He loved the theatre so much. But after that slightly rambly introduction, I do want to go through in alphabetical order, as I did for my video on the novelists and my video on the poets. And I want to quickly speak about some of the important playwrights of the Victorian period. And then I will go on just to discuss a little bit more about the cultural role of the Victorian theatre in general. So first off, I'll quickly talk about Dion Boucicault. Boucicault was born in 1820 and died in 1890. He was an actor and playwright who was operating in Victorian London and then later on in his life moved to New York and wrote plays there. He specialised in melodrama and farce, and although most of his plays have been forgotten, a few are still remembered and performed. For example, London Assurance is possibly his most play, which was on at the National Theatre in London a couple of years ago, but I miss it, so I cannot tell you that much about it. But anyway. Next, I want to mention E.L. Blanchard. He was born in 1820 and died in 1889, and he was the king of the Victorian pantomime. He wrote nearly 40, I think he wrote 37 pantomimes over his lifetime within the space of 40 years, all for various London theatres and all around Christmas time. And he kind of really developed the pantomime into the genre that it has become today and made it much more of a sort of Christmas tradition than it had been previously. I will also quickly mention Robert Browning. Robert Browning was born in 1812 and died in 1889. Robert Browning is mostly famous today and mostly famous during the Victorian period for being a poet, but he also was a playwright, and he collaborated on a play called Stratford with the very famous actor William Macready, who was one of the most important, significant actors in the Victorian period and was actually a good friend of Charles Dickens's as well. So Robert Browning collaborated on one play with him called Stratford, which did very well. He then wrote 2 further plays, but neither of these did very well because him and Macready had had a falling out. Macready was no longer acting in his plays, and that meant that people did not go and see him. So Robert Browning was not a very successful playwright in the end. I will also quickly mention Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens. Wilkie Collins was born in 1824 and died in 1889, and Charles Dickens was born in 1812 and died in 1870. Both of these are obviously much more famous for being novelists, but both had a great interest in the theatre, which they pursued throughout their life, especially Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens actually wanted to be an actor when he was young, and he did in fact have an audition at a theatre when he was in his 20s, but he was ill and didn't make it and therefore lost out on his chances of being an actor. He did, however, do a lot of work in amateur dramatics all of his life, and you can see from his novels his love of the theatre. Like so many of his novels and short stories and sketches and so on include various sort of theatrical scenes. If you look at Nicholas Nickleby, for example, and the way that the theatre is explored in there, you can see how Dickens kind of laughs at the theatre but also really enjoys it and is really kind of pulled in by it. And he was very interested in that world, and him and Wilkie Collins actually wrote a play called The Frozen Deep, which was performed in 1857. And it was actually in the performing of this play that Charles Dickens met Ellen Ternan, who actually went on to become his mistress, and she was one of the actresses performing in that play. And while we're on the subject of Ellen Ternan, I would mention that the biography of her called The Invisible Woman, which is written by Claire Tomalin, is actually, I think, one of the most interesting books to read in terms of getting a picture of the Victorian theatre, because Ellen Ternan was an actress and came from an acting family, and when you read The Invisible Woman, like, a portrait of what it was like to be an actress at the time is really interesting and very well done. And Dickens's interest in the theatre went way beyond sort of writing plays and being involved in amateur dramatics. I've just actually finished reading this book, which is called Charles Dickens on Theatre, which is a collection of his sort of writings on theatre, both fiction and non-fiction, which is really interesting and shows you kind of how much he loved the theatre and how important it was to him. He, like many people, was quite despairing about the state of drama within the 19th century and how awful some of the plays were, but despite the fact that he thought that British drama could be a lot better than it was, there's also a deep love for the theatre and a deep understanding for people who love going to the theatre no matter how awful the plays are. He was actually the first chairman of a charity called the General Theatrical Fund, which was set up in order to help provide pensions and sort of insurance, as it were, for actors who were out of work or who were struggling or who were too old or injured to work anymore, and to provide them with some kind of financial backup. Even after Charles Dickens was no longer the chairman, he was very important in this charity throughout a lot of his life. Next, I want to quickly talk about Gilbert and Sullivan. So William S. Gilbert was born in 1836 and died in 1911. And Arthur Sullivan was born in 1842 and died in 1900. Now Gilbert and Sullivan are very famous, and obviously they are famous as people who wrote operettas rather than plays, but I think when you're talking about Victorian drama and theatre, actually operettas are just as important as plays. These two men collaborated on 14 operettas, or light comic operas that were shorter than normal operas, and they were working in sort of the later half of the Victorian period. In fact, their operettas are probably the Victorian drama that survives the most today. Like, so many people still know and love Gilbert and Sullivan, and Gilbert and Sullivan have quite a cult following. We actually used to do a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas at my school because the way they're written, because they're operettas and they're supposed to be light and comic and quick, the music is so easy to learn. Like, it's so much easier than learning how to sing a musical. So we used to do them in school all the time, and they are really hilarious. They are of their time, and there are some of their operettas are great, and some of their operettas are quite sexist and quite racist, but the music in some of them is good as well. Quite interesting in the broader context of Victorian culture and literature to look at operettas, because operettas, which are sort of half sung and half spoken dialogue, they're not sung through like many musicals are today and like many operas, but a lot of them, like a major part of operettas is satire and social critique, in a similar way to sort of Dickens novels and various other important novels within the Victorian period. They use comedy to mock the social norms of the time and to critique politics and kind of social rules, but at the same time as having this sharp critique of society, they're also very driven by like romance and love plots and kind of adventurous schemes and stuff, and they have quite kind of stereotyped characters. In many ways you can kind of see Gilbert and Sullivan as being quite like Dickens. Next I want to quickly mention James Planchet. James Planchet was born in 1796 and died in 1880. Again, he is a Victorian playwright that we have completely forgotten. I don't think there are that many of his works that you can still read, but I might look up and see what I can find, but he's not one that anyone has really heard of. However, he did write 176 plays over the Victorian period, which is really quite impressive. And he wrote plays in a really huge range of genres, things like melodramas, but also farces and satires, also some operas and some adaptations of Victorian novels. I think one of his most famous plays was called The Island of Jewels. Next, let's talk about a Victorian playwright that we actually do remember, George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw was born in 1856 and died in 1950, so obviously he lived a very long time. In fact, he lived a very long time in general, but he lived a very long time after the Victorian period, and a lot of his plays, as I already said, were written after the Victorian period had ended. However, he did write a lot of very significant plays in the 1890s. Some of his most important and most remembered and best loved plays were written during the Victorian period, such as Mrs. Warren's Profession, Widowers' Houses, Philanderers, Men-at-Arms, Candida, You Never Can Tell. He was very important in the late Victorian period as a playwright, and was quite important, in fact, in kind of changing the face of British drama, because he was very critical of the state of British drama, very critical of how many plays were either revivals of old plays or were adaptations of novels or were melodramas. Like, there was nothing serious and new, there was no good proper new British drama. Certainly George Bernard Shaw's work deals with a lot more serious and complex themes than a lot of the kind of melodrama and farce at the time. If you look at a play like Mrs. Warren's Profession, what it says about morality and gender and sort of gender dynamics in the Victorian period is really, really interesting and really important. And you can see George Bernard Shaw in an attempt to try and make British drama more highbrow, more literary and more akin to the novel in its sort of social status. Next, I want to quickly mention Edward Sterling. Edward Sterling, whose real name was Edward Lambert, was born in 1809 and died in 1894. And Edward Sterling was a playwright in his own right, but most famous for adapting novels to stage. He adapted the novels of a wide range of authors, including Sir Walter Scott, William Harrison Ainsworth, and also Charles Dickens. He was the first person to adapt A Christmas Carol to the stage, and also adapted a lot of other Dickens books. Dickens novels were always being adapted to stage in the 19th century because people loved them. But in a sense, they worked well on stage because they were so theatrical. People really enjoyed watching his plays done on stage, and that was something that was done quite a lot. And Edward Sterling was the main person who wrote these. Like James Planchet, he was very, very prolific and wrote over 200 plays during his lifetime. And now let's talk about Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854 and died in 1900. Now, Oscar Wilde is, in my opinion, the finest Victorian dramatist. Not that there is that much competition, but his plays are absolutely brilliant. I love his plays. They are so funny, they are so witty, they have such a sharp social criticism and deal with such important issues. Like, I think often the play that people have seen of Oscar Wilde is The Importance of Being Earnest, which is a good play and I really enjoy it. It's very funny, but it's lighter than some of his other plays and it doesn't deal with as many kind of complex issues. Whereas the play A Woman of No Importance, which is my favourite play by him, and I wish I'd seen it performed, I've only read it, but it's one of my favourite plays of all time. It's just an amazing, like, feminist play, basically. It really is. And the way it's written and the way it talks about sort of gender dynamics and gender power play within the Victorian period and the way that people think about morality, especially in connection with women in the 19th century, is just absolutely fascinating and really definitely worth a read. He writes in a very interesting way. His dialogue is very funny, everything is very light, but what I like about Oscar Wilde's plays is that most of what his characters say is very, very lightly spoken. It's very kind of witty and airy, but actually there's a lot of depth and substance underneath the surface, and I think he does that very well, and I really, really do enjoy his plays. And so although Oscar Wilde takes the kind of language and tone of a lot of the less serious Victorian plays, he does have a lot more social criticism, the kind of social criticism that George Bernard Shaw wanted from 19th century plays that he felt was kind of lacking, and you can see a similarity in the issues that their plays deal with. So that's it for the Victorian playwrights, but I do want to talk about one other playwright who was not Victorian but was of massive, massive, massive importance within the Victorian period, and that is William Shakespeare. Now obviously William Shakespeare was not Victorian, he was dead about 220 years before the Victorian period began, but he was of massive importance in Victorian culture and of massive importance to Victorian theatre. I recently finished reading a book called Shakespeare and the Victorians, which I mentioned in my December wrap-up. It was quite like dry and academic, but there were a lot of really interesting points in there, and it was really interesting to read about the way the Victorians saw Shakespeare and the relationship that Victorian society had with William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was of massive importance. If you read Victorian novels, you will find so many Shakespearean references, like so many. Everyone knew Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was kind of considered like the moral playwright and as a sort of pinnacle of morality. Drama in the 19th century, like the theatre, was in general considered like morally dubious, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but Shakespeare was like the exception to that. Shakespeare was moral, Shakespeare was okay. Children were taught to read Shakespeare from a young age, and Shakespeare was of such significance in the Victorian period, such cultural significance, such dramatic significance. People who went to the theatre, the most respectable thing to go and see was Shakespeare, and people from all classes loved Shakespeare and went to see Shakespeare all the time. Shakespeare was so loved in the Victorian period. There was a huge movement, for example, to save the Shakespeare birthplace house in Stratford-upon-Avon, which a wide range of Victorian authors, including Charles Dickens, were really prominent in trying to raise money to save this house from being bought or being knocked down. And the way that people felt about Shakespeare, people, you know, went on sort of pilgrimages to Stratford-upon-Avon. It was when Stratford-upon-Avon became a kind of tourist site in a way. The way that Shakespeare was thought of in the Victorian period is really, really important, and even more important, I think, when you consider the fact that Victorian theatre, like Victorian drama, plays that were being written in the Victorian period were not very good and were not considered very good. They didn't have high literary praise in the way that novels and poetry, especially of the Victorian period, did. But Shakespeare had, and Shakespeare was brilliant, and everyone knew Shakespeare was brilliant, and that was almost made Shakespeare even more important because they didn't produce drama like that in the Victorian period, although they did perform Shakespeare an awful, awful lot. If you read any non-fiction writing written during the Victorian period about the theatre by Charles Dickens or by anyone else, about at least half of the names of the plays you just will have never heard of, and the other half are Shakespeare. That's basically what the balance is, because Shakespeare was done so much. Now I do just want to quickly talk about the kind of genres and venues of theatrical doings and the theatre in the Victorian period, because when I talk about theatre, I'm immediately thinking of like plays, but actually there's a lot more to Victorian theatre than that. So for example, music halls were incredibly important during the Victorian period. Music halls became very popular from the middle of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and they were long shows formed of a combination of things, including music performances, dancing, sketches, short plays, comedians, songs, and so many other things. And although these aren't like plays, it's not really what you necessarily think of as theatre. It was the way that a lot of people kind of experienced theatre. And there was a Copyright Act in 1842 which made it much easier for people to sing songs that didn't belong to them, and after that music halls kind of exploded. And then I want to quickly talk about operas and operettas. I've already spoken quickly about operettas earlier on when I was talking about Gilbert and Sullivan, but operas were obviously also important in the Victorian period, and operas, as they are today, were much more of a kind of higher class affair than the rest of the theatrical world. Going to the opera was something much more for the wealthy and for the upper classes. Operettas, which are also sometimes called Savoy operas, had a much broader class appeal, and the audience was often made up of the middle classes. Operettas grew out of kind of French comic operas in the middle of the 19th century, and in Victorian Britain, operettas became sort of a thing really with Gilbert and Sullivan in the 1850s. As I mentioned earlier, these weren't sung through like operas, but had gaps for dialogue as well as the songs, and they did tend to use a lot of parody and satire, a lot of comedy to critique society, as well as having the kind of conventional romance tropes of many other Victorian straight plays during the 19th century. I need to talk about the theatre and plays themselves. The theatre occupies a really interesting social and cultural position within Victorian Britain because people loved the theatre. Like, a lot of people went to the theatre and a lot of people loved the theatre. When Dickens writes about the theatre, you can see how much he loved it. You can see the appeal of the theatre from the way that he writes about it and from his fascination with it. And likewise, in so many other writers, there are lots of theatrical references in a lot of other novels. And you can tell when you read non-fiction from the time or theatrical reviews or so on, when Dickens writes about how many people went to the theatre and what going to the theatre in the Victorian period was like, you can tell how many people loved the theatre and how many people loved going there. There is a fascination with the theatre throughout Victorian literature and what there was throughout Victorian culture. But at the same time, the theatre was held in a very dubious moral position. It was not necessarily immoral to go to the theatre, and there were a lot of very different kinds of theatre. So I'm just going to read you a sentence from one of Dickens's reviews of a particular play, and he says, "We would assuredly not bear harder upon the 4-penny theatre than on the 4-shilling theatre or the 4-guinea theatre." And that sentence, I think, tells you how many different kinds of theatres there were. Like, it was very different to go to the 4-guinea theatre, to go to the expensive theatre, than it was to go to the 4-penny theatre. The difference between sort of going to a high-class theatre where you saw Shakespeare and going to a very low-class theatre where you just saw melodrama and farce, like, although actually Shakespeare was performed everywhere, but anyway, like, there was a huge difference in the kind of theatre you went to. And going to the theatre didn't necessarily have to be immoral, but acting, that was definitely considered immoral. The theatre was popular in the 19th century. A lot of people went, a lot of theatres were built in the Victorian period, but it was considered to be kind of morally dubious to be involved in that sort of thing. It was considered a morally dubious world. This is partly just to do with the way that actors lived, because they moved around a lot of the time, because they performed on stage as people they weren't, which seemed kind of inherently false to the Victorian sensibility. And a lot of it is to do with the role that women had in the theatre, because partly, of course, female actresses were working, which was one issue in the Victorian period, but also they were acting in a kind of like scandalous way. Like, often a woman acting in a part on the stage would have to act to befit her character in a way that would not be appropriate for a Victorian woman to act. Like, actresses were considered to be figures of immorality. Being an actress was almost considered as being akin to prostitution within the Victorian period. And this is partly to do with the way they had to act on stage, and also partly to do with the fact that being a working woman and being an actress made you much more independent, and also in a way to do with the way that family structures were very different. For example, in The Invisible Woman by Claire Tomalin, when she's writing about the life of Dickens's later mistress, Ellen Ternan, she talks about Ellen's family and various other people she knew in the acting world, and how sort of romantic relationships and marriage was much more fluid in the kind of acting world. Like, a lot more couples got separated and that kind of thing, because they didn't really abide to the same rules of respectability as the rest of the Victorian society, because they were moving from place to place all the time often, and because they were living in a very different world. They were acting in a very sort of different way, and so they didn't sort of stick to the same respectable rules, which made the rest of Victorian society quite uncomfortable. If you read The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury, which is a brilliant book, one of the main characters in that, Bianca, is an actress, and the way that she talks, one, about being an actress, but also about the way that people perceive her because she's an actress, is really, really interesting in terms of thinking about Victorian theatre. Another interesting thing to look at is Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. I know obviously Jane Austen is not Victorian, she's dead a good 20 years before the Victorian period started, but Mansfield Park, which was published in 1814, a good while before the Victorian period, in that there are some young characters who decide they want to do some amateur dramatics, and everyone's like, but that's so immoral, what are you doing? That's really not respectable. And to a modern reader, it's just really weird. Like, part of the reason why I think Mansfield Park is so much less popular than the rest of Jane Austen is because it's just really hard to get your head around the fact that so many people would think that to engage in amateur dramatics is immoral. But I think if you read Mansfield Park, which is at the beginning of the 19th century, it gives you a sense for the way that theatre was perceived throughout the whole of the 19th century. The fact that acting, because it's pretending to be someone else, therefore must be kind of inherently dishonest and immoral. Like, it's absolutely fascinating to think about the way that the Victorians perceived it, because they loved going to the theatre, they really did, but they also considered to be in a play, to be acting, as immoral. Just a really interesting kind of conflict of ideas about the theatre, and it means that the theatre and drama occupied a kind of weird place within Victorian society. It's perhaps part of the reason why we don't have that many kind of great dramatists to remember from the Victorian period, because if you had literary aims, if you wanted to be respected for your literature and for your art, You weren't going to write plays because you wouldn't be respected for that. You'd write novels and you'd write poetry because that would win you critical respect. Writing plays wouldn't. It might win you money, it might win you love of people, but it wouldn't win you the same critical respect because it just wasn't considered to be in the same league. So I think that's basically all I wanted to say about the Victorian theatre. I hope this has been an interesting introduction to drama and the theatre in the Victorian period, and I'm sorry if I've got on for a long time. I'm really glad to be making this series again about the Victorian period, and I'm really enjoying getting back into how to speak Victorian. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks there will be the next video in how to speak Victorian, which will be about essay writers and non-fiction during the Victorian period. But until then, I hope you have a good Victorian week and happy reading.